Welcome to our podcast, Interrogating Strategy with Denice. This afternoon is Mr. Mathew Cruz. Welcome, Mathew, to our podcast.
Thank you.
Please introduce yourself, Mathew. I know you're an energy expert and a well-experienced executive. Please give us a brief background of yourself.
Great, thank you very much, and thank you for having me on your podcast. I really appreciate it. So my name is Mathew Cruz, and I'm a self-proclaimed energy expert. So I've been that for about a year now, and on a weekly basis, I am talking on the TV or the news or on the radio about the energy sector, because there's so much happening that's taking place in the energy sector. I came to be an energy expert by working in Eskom for 11 years, and in the last 2.5 years, I was working as a management consultant to advising the board and the C-suite of Eskom directly about the current state of Eskom and the energy sector, and also the future states of Eskom and the energy sector, and about the unbundling process as well. So I'll talk a little bit more about unbundling process, but that's just in terms of how I became an energy expert. And I currently work at a company called Home Energy, and we are the Uber for solar installations. So we're a platform business, a platform marketplace, where we integrate financiers for solar installations with people that are looking for installations, within the suppliers of the goods, and then the installers, the installation teams. So we ourselves are not a financier or installer or a supplier, but we connect all of these parties together on a platform to have all of their needs met. And we primarily source our clients from the banks, and we're the only company that's trusted by the banks to service their clients with solar installation services.
Great, Mathew. Mathew, you participated in one of the panel discussions yesterday, and any feedback and input, what can you share in terms of some of the key points that you discussed with the panel yesterday?
Sure, so the panel yesterday was looking at demand side management and smart devices and their role in the transition going forward, and how smart devices will create energy efficiency within the energy sector. And we heard from some manufacturers of smart devices, and from my side I was focusing on the aspects of a home energy virtual power plant, which is an interesting concept. A virtual power plant, just to talk about what that is, it's a platform, a software platform that sits online and takes in and integrates the energy distributed resources in the country. So it could be solar panels, gas turbines, or batteries, and it integrates that within where the demand is needed. So then it provides the demand. So by implementing a virtual power plant online, we can actually reduce one stage of load shedding in the country within 12 months to a year and a half. And so we're looking at approaching the different municipalities and regions within South Africa to implement a virtual power plant. And what's exciting about the virtual power plant is not just integrating batteries, but also the devices like a smart geyser. And we can do some kind of demand side management. When we're going to go from stage 5 to stage 6, for example, we can switch off a whole bunch of geysers that are happening or firing at 6 p.m. and through that then also reduce the demand as well as increase the supply. And through that, increasing supply and reducing demand, we can reduce one stage of load shedding. So that's kind of what I was talking about on the panel.
Very interesting indeed. Just based on your experience, let's talk about the readiness of municipalities to adopt some of these innovative technologies that you've just mentioned. How ready are we? We've seen the space being dominated by metros, like City of Johannesburg, City of Cape Town, Ekurhuleni, and so forth. But the smaller municipalities are still struggling. They don't have the capacity to formulate energy policies, to formulate energy programs, to deliver on some of these energy challenges.
Yes.
What's your take on that?
So that's very good commentary, and it is we're seeing good policy being led by the Gauteng province and by Cape Town as well that you mentioned, and it's almost like it's first being piloted in these provinces, and then the other provinces and municipalities will see how it's done and what works, and getting learning lessons and then implement that. And there is also that aspect of limited capacity that you mentioned, of creating a policy, of creating a platform that can, for example, take on the applications for small-scale embedded generation of solar and battery installations at homes and businesses. A lot of municipalities, the smaller ones, have a paper process that you have to submit a form asking for permission, then they get back to you, and it can sometimes take 6 months to 9 months for them to reply. So that alone shows the kind of delay that's taking place in some of the smaller municipalities. There is hope because we are looking at a platform being rolled out nationally for all the municipalities that can do this process online and do it immediately. So we're seeing those kind of the tenders being put out into the marketplace for private sector companies to provide that service. So there is hope on the horizon. But apart from just the application, there's also the smart meters that are needed in order for homes and businesses to be able to provide electricity onto the grid. And those smart meters being rolled out in a big way, I don't see us being able to rely on the small municipalities to drive that. It would need to be seen more from national government driving the rolling out of smart meters into homes and businesses.
No, great, Mathew. Mathew, you'd recall yesterday the Minister of Electricity made an announcement on the energy action plan, and in his presentation he focused on about 5 critical outcomes. The first one being enabling private sector investment in new generation capacity. The second one is accelerating procurement of new capacity from renewables, gas and battery storage. And the third one is unleashing businesses, households to invest in rooftop solar and the transformation of the electricity sector. Let's start with the first outcome, enabling private sector investment in new generation capacity. Now, I'm sitting here today and I see a lot of foreign-owned companies dominating the space at the Solar Africa company. Now, if we're going to enable private sector invest in new generation, are we talking local private sector? And how are we going to ensure that we support the local players? Because it's just not right that we open up the space only for it to be taken up by foreign-owned firms.
Yes, yeah.
I know it's a very controversial question I'm asking.
No, it's okay. So I'd like to focus on 2 aspects of that. The first is investment into self-generation and investment into generation, and then also the local players versus international players that are providing the technology for that generation. So first of all, looking at the investment into generation, what we're seeing is it's a bit of a difficult environment at the moment for private sector to invest in their own generation assets, mostly because we don't know what the price of electricity is going to be in 3 years' time. Mm-hmm. As we see, NERSA dictates the price of electricity on a 2-year basis, and when you're putting money down into an asset that's going to last 20 or 25 years of a solar farm or a solar farm with batteries, for instance, it's difficult to determine what will my return on investment be as a private company, because that's what they're focusing on, is what is my return on my investment going to be when we don't know what the price of electricity is going to be. Right. So there's an aspect of determining what the feed-in tariff will be for the next 20 years or 15 years that's on the horizon but hasn't come yet, and that's one of the things that can be done to accelerate private investments, because if we can get a confirmed feed-in tariff that's going to be in place for 20 years, then I can capitalize my project, because I can say, well, this will be my returns if I invest this 1 billion rand now in this plant. Right. So that's an example of ways in which government can assist in private generation assets coming down and companies investing in private generation. Right. To talk about what technology is going to be used for the private generation, let's focus on the sector that I'm experiencing with solar, where we have a lot of international companies, mostly from China, coming in and saying we'll provide you with the inverters and the batteries that are needed and the solar panels. And about 80% of all of the equipment that's produced for solar technology is produced in China. And there's certain ways in which they've almost got a moat around their production capacity, where it'll be difficult for us to compete, but then also other ways in which we can compete. So we can compete very well with batteries and inverters in the sector. So we're looking at the solar sector now. And we are seeing good companies. So we've got Freedom One here, we've got Solar MD that produce local batteries, and they're doing it in a way that is competitive price-wise. They even come in at cheaper prices than your SunSync batteries or your other batteries like Hubble, those kinds of tier 1 batteries that are coming from China. So the reason why they're able to do that is they get in the cells that could also be potentially produced here, but are produced in China at the moment. They get in the lithium-ion cells that take a lot of energy to create, and then they put it into a battery pack that works really well, and through that are able to then undercut the kind of market price at the moment. It would be nice to see inverters and batteries fully locally produced from raw materials coming from South Africa, being produced here. but there is a little bit of a moat around that. And to talk about what that moat looks like, let's talk about solar panels, which I don't see being produced in South Africa. So the way in which China got a moat which will defend against people coming in and taking their space in this sector is they've been for a long time investing in generation capacity within the country. So they've grown the size of Eskom in terms of 40 gigawatts of generation capacity for about the last 15 years. And the last 2 years they grew by 20 gigawatts of coal capacity. So there's been a lot of coal that's been deployed historically in China. And what we see is that they provide then cheap, consistent power for producing solar panels. And solar panels themselves, to melt down sand, to get silicon, to then put it into the place that it needs to be in order to get wafers, is extremely energy intensive. To give you an idea, one production plant can take about 20 gigawatts worth of power, and that's almost our current generation capacity. We're sitting at the moment, we're producing about 23,000 gigawatts, or 23,000 megawatts, sorry, of electricity in South Africa, and our demand then is like 28,000, so we then have 6 stages of load shedding. Right. So almost our entire generation capacity of South Africa can go into one production facility for solar panels. Right. And through that, they kind of, through efficiencies of scale, use lots of cheap power to produce the solar panels, right, and then ship it here at a price that we'll never be able to meet in South Africa. Well, I say never. I mean, one hopes that by 2035, 2040, we'll be in a place where we have ample capacity of electricity generation. But that depends on what decisions are made now and how the Gauteng government comes and the Cape Town government and the national government come to the party. So there's a moat that is making it difficult for local manufacturers and producers price-wise to get into the game on solar panels, but there is definitely space within batteries and inverters. So in that way, we can see where the opportunities lie and then encourage battery and inverter production. And just to last little points about that, one way that can be encouraged is capital can be provided for those companies, because at the moment they're selling batteries, like Freedom One, for example, and then taking the money from the batteries being sold to then produce more batteries. But if they had some kind of big credit facility from the government or a government-backed credit facility through the banks, then they would be able to scale up their production facilities. So that's one way that the government could assist with localized production.
Great. And thanks for that. Now, the second outcome the minister mentioned yesterday is accelerating procurement of new capacity, right? Now, let's talk about procurement. I know that from 2010, we've been running one of the most successful energy procurement processes in the world, from bid window 1 up to bid window 4, although it was stopped for almost 2 years. We don't want to get into why it was stopped for that period, but we do know that Mr. Mantashe in 2019 then opened the space up. He introduced bid window 5 and bid window 6, and I understand that bid window 7 is going to be opened up very soon. So from a procurement point of view, I just want to find out, are you happy with the progress that we've made from bid window 1 to bid window 5 in terms of the additional capacity that we've added to the grid?
Am I happy? That's an interesting question, and it's very pertinent.
I mean, the question is, a lot has gone into this processes. Money has been pumped in. Yeah. Financial institutions have spent money, but we are still sitting with challenges of load shedding.
Yes.
When is the additional capacity going to be added to the grid?
So in terms of additional capacity, that's the one exciting announcement that I saw from the electricity minister with the next bid window 7 coming up, where he said he wants 12 to 15,000 megawatts to be incentivized where it can be implemented into the grid. And that's an important distinction, because when we saw bid window 5 and 6 having a bit of a hurdle or a bit of upsets happening is with capacity constraints. So specifically, like if we just focus on bid window 6 and what happened there, it was announced last year that it would be doubled from 2,600 megawatts to 5,200 megawatts in terms of its size to get more capacity onto the grid. And unfortunately, what we saw then, as a result of the companies that proposed, is that unfortunately wind capacity cannot come onto the grid from the south of the country where the wind resources are. So we had then capacity constraints limiting the amount of wind capacity that can come on from the south of the country to provide power in the north of the country. And that led the bin window then to, unfortunately, not, instead of being 5,200 megawatts in terms of what's going to come on, go down to about 1,300 megawatts. And that then necessitated the shift of focus. And this is one of the great things about the electricity minister coming into power and coming into place, is that there's a new way of thinking and also a seemingly renewed conversation about how do we get power onto the grid. So then the shift of focus came to, okay, where can we put power onto the grid immediately so it can go straight into the grid, and there's thousands of megawatts of capacity that can be accepted. So an example is Mpumalanga is very good as a province that can accept large solar onto the grid. Also Gauteng, where it's being used. This is one of the best places to install solar and battery installations on large scale, because the power can be used locally. So that's an example of increasing the amount of renewable energy that can come onto the grid. In terms of what happened with bin window 1 to 4, as you correctly said, it was one of the world's best REIPP bin windows, so renewable energy independent power producer bin windows, and it was world renowned in terms of how we went about it, its response, and how we implemented it. What was the focus at the time, however, was just to get renewable onto the grid, not so much getting renewable onto the grid when the demand happens in the evenings and the mornings. So there was just kind of solar farms without batteries, or wind farms without any kind of dispatchable capabilities. And there was also no focus really on dispatchable gas, which we see about 30% of Europe is using gas, 20% in America is using gas power. We didn't really see much focusing on that because it was just kind of, we need to get renewables onto the grid. Right. Now we're having a shift of focus of, we need power in the mornings and the evenings, dispatchable power. So now we also need to include batteries as an example, or hydropower as a renewable way of storing power and then giving it back when it's needed in the evenings. And then also gas to power is also coming a bit to the forefront. And then maybe in 10 years' time we'll have nuclear coming again, but we'll see what happens with nuclear. At the moment it's not really being focused on.
Right. No, thanks for that, Mathew. Now let's talk about the transmission network itself. It's all good that we want to accelerate and fast track all these renewable projects. But then how about the transmission network itself? Does it have the capacity to handle all of these projects once they are all completed?
So the answer is no and yes. So I'll start with no, and then I'll get to the happy news of yes. So no, in the sense that the transmission lines between the south of the country, like Cape Town, and the north of the country, Gauteng, where it's needed, the power is mostly needed here because this is where all the economic activity is happening mostly, and also around Mpumalanga. The transmission lines are limited in terms of putting more power onto the grid for wind capacity, and that's in the south. And then also when we look at the Northern Cape, in terms of they've got lots of resources of sun. Radiation levels are the best there in the country. But however, they can't take too much more solar farms in the Northern Cape because the grid capacity is limiting the amount of power that can flow. So it's both in the Northern Cape and on the north, that side where it's sun, and then the wind, they can't come on. However, so that's the no in terms of capacity constraints, and that's when we hear about it's going to take between 5 to 8 years to build new transmission lines that can take thousands of megawatts from those regions, and we hear about that delay. The yes is that we have amazing transmission capabilities within the provinces of Gauteng and in Mpumalanga, where typically the coal power would be produced. Right. And those transmission lines can take on thousands of megawatts at a time of new capacity or new generation onto the grid. In terms of our transmission grid, I honestly think we have one of the best transmission grids in the world. We service 90% of the area of South Africa with our grid, and about 85 to 90% of the people of South Africa with electricity. And that's an amazing first world, or you can say that's the old way of referring to it, first world or developed nation. That's beating most developed nations in terms of energy supply to the nation. Right. So that's our transmission grid is very good. It also has redundancy. So if there's one line that fails, then we have another line typically that's able to take over the power, unless it's one of those massive lines that we saw in Pretoria East recently, unfortunately, where the whole the infrastructure that should never collapsed due to sabotage or due to vandalism. Apart from that one situation, we actually have quite a redundant and strong transmission grid. that in Gauteng and Mpumalanga can take on thousands of megawatts of generating capacity. So an example of this is Komati Power Station, where I started my career. It was a coal power station. It was revived. It was mothballed initially and revived to provide power in 27, 28, 29, 2010, and now has been decommissioned again and replaced with renewable energy. So now solar and wind and battery is coming and being installed there as an initial start to what's going to happen in the region. And that's an example of how new capacity can come onto the grid very easily at old power stations that are closing down. Because they already have the high voltage yard, they can take the power, convert it into the thousands of kilovolts that is needed, or thousands of volts that are needed to be, 144,000 volts that it needs to be to get onto the grid. It's already there, the infrastructure. Right. So there are great places, old power stations that can be utilized as sites for large-scale capacity coming onto the grid. Not just renewable, but also gas and battery as well.
Battery as well. Yeah. No, thank you so much. So now, talking about the power stations, there are about, is it 5 or 6 coal-fired power stations that are due for decommissioning in the next 2 to 3 years?
Well, it's more like 6 years, and it was 6 power stations, including Komati, but now it's 5. So it's Camden, Arnott, Creel, Kurtflay, and I'm missing one of those. My memory isn't serving me.
Is it not Kendall?
Is it Kendall? And I think Kendall's one of the. It might be Kendall. So but basically the oldest power stations are scheduled to come offline, and we're seeing now talks about saying it doesn't make sense to take them offline if they're still generating power when we're in an energy crisis. So that commentary is interesting, and it's coming into the fore, and it's actually a commentary that I would agree with, because when we're sitting with load shedding and we have a generation capacity that's running and going, why turn it off? Rather wait for it to, it's a concept called sweating the assets from maintenance term. Wait for it to have some kind of catastrophic failure somewhere, or a definite need to come offline due to aging of the mills, that crushes the coal or the boiler itself, getting to a point where it just wouldn't make sense from a capital perspective to replace the entire boiler, because the rest of the power station only has about 2 years left anyway. So rather sweat the assets instead of have a forced closure. I know it goes against some of the environmental commitments that we've made. Yeah. So there's a very interesting kind of interplay there, and I can't comment too much on exactly what we should do. It's interesting, like what is happening. Right. But I can say that in the context of an energy crisis, it does kind of make sense not to turn off generation capacity that's there at the moment.
Okay. So let's talk about repurposing of these power stations. You mentioned already Komati, which has been repurposed as a renewable energy power plant. I think it's 300. So
it depends. Sorry, let me finish. You finish your question. Yeah.
No, go ahead.
Great. So at the moment, the plan for Komati, and this is the first plan, because there's a lot more that's going to be happening in the area, as it also becomes like a hub of renewed activity and interest from international markets as well. The plan is to install 150 megawatts of solar, and then 70 megawatts of wind, and then 150 megawatts of battery. So in that sense, if you add them all up, it gets to 370. But in terms of what will actually come onto the grid at any point, it's a bit different, because your solar is producing power in the middle of the day, and the batteries are then storing the power to put it onto the grid in the evenings. Your wind is at 70% or 70 megawatts. You typically, on average, unfortunately, get about 20% of your nameplate capacity, unless you install more than your nameplates, and then just say that your capacity is 70. You get about 20% of capacity from your wind assets. So that looks like 14 megawatts at any point in time over a week. Sometimes it can go up to 70 if the wind's blowing hard, but on average, when you average it out, it's about 14 megawatts. Right. So in terms of what we'll see coming onto the grid, it's variable. It's variable. It can't be like, you can't say consistently there'll be 150 megawatts at all times from that power station. But we can say that during the middle of the day, the sun, is very consistent there. We can say that we can most likely say that we'll get 150 megawatts during the day from that power station, and then in the night you've got 150 megawatt hour battery, so it'll provide 150 megawatts for 1 hour, but more likely they'll smoothen that out and say we'll provide 50 megawatts for 3 hours over the evening peak. Right. And part of the wind capacity will be providing electricity during that time as well, and also charging the batteries when the sun isn't shining, like in the mornings and the late evenings.
Right. Clearly, a lot of challenges going forward in as far as transmission and grid management is concerned. Now let's talk about the unbundling of Eskom, in particular having an independent transmission entity. What are the benefits, what are the pros and cons of having an unbundled, so to speak, Eskom entity?
Great. So yeah, that's very good question in terms of pros and cons, because there's not just one side. There's two sides of the story. So there's certain pros that have been in place for South Africa by having a monopolized situation with Eskom providing power. And one of the big pros is that we're able to subsidize the price of electricity for the nation, for the citizens of the nation, and not have a cost-reflective price of electricity. We're able to do things like have a cost-plus situation with the mines that are connected to the power station. Oftentimes, a mine was developed with a power station in mind that would directly feed coal to the power station on a conveyor belt, which then removes the cost of transportation through rail or trucks. So we were able to do massive upscaling of generation capacity through having one entity that was responsible for providing electricity. We were also able to do things like what wouldn't be the case if we had already a democratized state of an energy sector, of rolling out transmission to the country. So it usually wouldn't make sense if you're thinking from like pure capitalist perspective or earnings or ROI perspective to build a transmission line all the way to a small town that doesn't necessarily have a lot of money to provide for buying electricity, then won't necessarily be paying a lot of the electricity money that's owed. It doesn't really make sense from a capitalist perspective as a private company to build that transmission line. But for the government to say that it's our mandate to provide power to the people, then it does make sense to build a transmission line as Eskom to that town and provide power there, because there's a different purpose than just creating money, and that's the benefit that we had, and we have still in place with Eskom providing power, the majority of power there. There is unfortunately that's the pros. Let's talk about the cons now. There has been, unfortunately, this situation of declining service from Eskom over the years. And for whatever reason, we can say that they didn't have enough funding, or it's because of the cost of electricity being subsidized, but then Eskom not getting enough money to compensate for not having a cost-reflective tariff. So being underfunded, we could say that. And then we could also then say, well, Eskom just continuously ask for more money, but we don't see much benefit coming out of it. So there's like different ways of viewing the problem. But if we look at the cons of the situation, we haven't been able to have too much independent power producers come on outside of the bid windows. So there wasn't too much generation licenses that were provided to independent power producers. And up until recently, we haven't seen too much of that. So there's been a limitation of the companies that can come online and provide power outside of Eskom. Because of this kind of monopolized system on Master State, Eskom was the main producer, and they weren't really incentivized to allow independent power producers to put power onto the grid cheaper than they can provide it. Now we're going towards that unbundled state, and just to clarify, we did have this in mind. There was a white paper released in 1998 that was talking about going towards unbundled state and democratized energy sector, as in most developed countries, as there is a way of excellence coming from competition. Initially you have a bit of a rise of the price of electricity as companies come on board. The first movers, they want return on their investment. They want to get some kind of benefit for being the first movers and taking the risk. So you have a rise of electricity, but then as other companies see the opportunity, independent power producers, and invest in generation assets, and everyone's bidding to put power into the grid, then we see the bid prices.
What role can NASA play in ensuring that we bring down the cost of electricity for the benefit of the citizens of this country?
Sure, that's quite a complex topic that we're talking about now, but I'll give it my shot in terms of answering. So with NERSA, what role do they have to play? Yeah, you're correct in saying that every time a submission was happening from Eskom, and I was in one of the meetings that we were deciding what shall we apply for this year, and the conversation went along the lines of, well, we know that NERSA typically gives us half of what we apply for. So we know that we need 11% increase this year, to meet our costs in terms of the finances, but because NERSA doesn't listen to the 11% and then gives us half of what we asked for, we'll ask for 21%. That was how the conversation, that was like along the lines of the conversation, because for the longest time, NERSA seemed to not be using a set formula that could be interrogated and pointed to as to how they came up with the 11% instead of the 21%. And it's, to use a word, it was almost ethereal in terms of how they arrived at the number, and there wasn't a consistent approach from NERSA in terms of this is the price. It was almost like they were following a priority or a mandate to continue to provide cheap power to South African people, which is a very good mandate because unfortunately the poorest of the poor are the ones that are suffering the most when you increase the price of electricity, and there is specific priorities coming from the government that NERSA has to listen to in terms of keeping the price of electricity low. Yeah. So that was kind of their approach that they were going up until about last year, and now we see the 18.65% coming through, recognizing that Eskom for the longest time has been kind of underfunded in not being able to collect money that's cost reflective of their costs of the price of electricity, and unfortunately that is the reality, is that it is a bit more expensive to produce electricity than what our price of electricity had been for the last 10 years. And so we had continuously like minimal money coming in for Eskom than what is being spent to produce the power. So going forward, NERSA has a critical role to play in setting the price of electricity and doing things like setting feed-in tariffs. And we see now a commentary coming from the government and NERSA talking about net metering and what that looks like, and how the net metering will work on a local municipality level of the feed-in tariff should be reflective of the cost of electricity that's going to be replaced with the feed-in tariff. And so that pegs it at a minimum of about 182 in terms of the feed-in tariff, and that was set by NERSA and the government, and so they inform then how are we going to price electricity going forward. And I'd love to see decades or multi-decade long determinations of the price of electricity coming from NERSA, instead of just every 2 years this is this percentage increase, and then setting the framework for independent power producers to put money down and understand this is what their returns are going to be. And this is what we saw in the Vietnam country recently as well. So we can go into that a little bit more if you'd like as well.
Yeah, we will in a moment. Now, linked to what you just said, clearly, I mean, just to be fair to Eskom, they are facing very serious challenges in as far as their financial sustainability. They've opened up the space, and we've done away with the threshold in terms of self-generation. But are they not also faced with the risk of declining revenues? Because your power users, mining industry, manufacturing, are now self-generating. And now we are encouraging households to also go to self-generate. What does the future look like when you look at Eskom from a financial sustainability point of view? Aren't they faced with declining revenues, given the complexities and the challenges associated with their tariff setting and also revenue generation and recovery and cost recovery measures?
So that's a very good commentary, and what you're referring to is a topic or concept called the utility death spiral, which is actually international, or you probably know this, but it's an international phenomenon that's happening in all developed countries, where the utility is facing the situation where the users that would typically be paying the most for electricity and providing the most margin, the biggest users, are seeing that it's actually better for them to take care of their own energy needs. Put down solar farms with battery, put down a gas generator or diesel generator, and provide their own electricity. And so we see the kind of upper echelon, or the top quartile or the top third of the electricity users switching to providing their own power. And then revenue is now declining for the utility, and then the price of electricity increases, and then we see the middle third or the middle half then also seeing, oh, well, the price of electricity being this now, it actually makes sense for me to go solar and battery solutions for myself and just take care of my own energy needs. And then we're left with like the kind of lower quartile being relied upon to provide the revenue, which they can't, unfortunately. And so then the utility goes through the utility death spiral, and then a transition happens away from this big utilities. So we have an interesting context in South Africa, which which seemingly flips that on its head, seemingly. And let me explain. In South Africa, with load shedding, a very different context, and diesel being fired for the first 2,000 megawatts to try and mitigate load shedding, to go away from stage 6 to go down to stage 4. We're firing diesel-fired turbines, and those turbines typically cost 10 times more than coal. You know, it's R4.40 per kilowatt hour coming out, and that's just coming out of the plant, never mind what actually is at the home. So up until you actually stop load shedding from happening, we have this interesting situation where if you remove a house or a business from the grid, you actually assist Eskom in being more profitable. So even though you're removing revenue, they would have been firing diesel to power that house or that business. So if you remove the load from the grid and you have them go independent with solar and battery and diesel generator for themselves, you actually assist in, first of all, bringing down the demand and stopping load shedding, but then also increasing the profitability of Eskom, because now they don't have to fire diesel anymore for that business or that house. So up until you stop load shedding, for that last 2,000 megawatts, that last little bit, up until you've stopped load shedding, and then you no longer need to fire your gas turbines, you actually are helping Eskom be more profitable and giving them more money by removing yourself as a load. So we almost have like a reversal of the utility death spiral in that sense, and I don't see that being focused on too much within South Africa, but it's a very important context because you actually help both South Africa stop load shedding by reducing your demand if you take yourself off the grid or become grid adjacent. You also help Eskom be more profitable as well. So it's like almost personal wealth being invested to help solve the problem, which I really like that situation.
I've got a very interesting case study for you. Let's look at Soweto. Right.
Soweto, okay.
You know the debt issues around Soweto. Soweto owns billions to Eskom. Now, if Soweto residents were to decide tomorrow that they want to go solar rooftop, what difference will that make to Eskom's bottom line?
Sure. If there was a program that was rolled out for every house to have a solar panel, for instance, and a battery situation, that would go a long way, a very long way in assisting Eskom and also the energy crisis to be reduced. The reason why I say that is because when you provide energy to that person, first of all, for them, load shedding has stopped because then they're generating their own power. So then for the whole of Soweto, you've stopped load shedding, which has its own very beneficial aspects to it for the people that are living there. Apart from that, then you also then are no longer saying, well, I'm owed money from Soweto. You're no longer saying that. You're no longer accounting for the billions that you're hoping will come out, but they're not getting from there. And for whatever reason, we're not going to go into like why that is the case, but you no longer say, well, I'm owed money, I'm not getting it, so therefore give me out. So you'll just no longer have the expectation of money coming from Soweto. So it's like a win-win almost situation, because now Eskom can focus on providing power elsewhere and also not firing its gas diesel turbines in order to provide power for the thousands of megawatts that you potentially, or it's not thousands of megawatts coming out of Soweto, but for the megawatts coming out of Soweto, you no longer need to fire diesel to provide that. So I think that it's a very good concept.
Mathew, lastly, now let's look at the global perspective. I'd like us to focus on the exponential increase in the cost of electricity. Yeah.
Great. So I'd like to first focus on Vietnam, and then I'd like to focus on Australia. So Vietnam, they rolled out a program that incentivized 9,000 megawatts coming onto the grid from their citizens paying for that. Yeah. So they did this by providing a 20-year feed-in tariff that was set at a price per kilowatt that was above the current price of electricity at the time in 2020. So they said also you have 6 months to install solar panels on your roofs. So from the middle of the year until the 1st of January 2021. And if you do get solar panels installed, then we'll give you this feed-in tariff for 20 years, which is above the price of electricity, which immediately made the investment decision positive for anyone that was looking at solar. And so then you had the citizens of the country putting their own money down, their own wealth into their businesses and their homes to put solar panels on their roof, which incentivized 9,000 megawatts coming on to the grid in a 6-month period. And to put that into context, that's 9 stages of load shedding that would be removed from the South African grid, because those people are powering their own homes and their own energy needs, and then also providing power to the country. So it's maybe 4,500 megawatts, or half of it was powering themselves, and then half was going to the grid. But overall, it's 9,000 megawatts is not needed to be accounted for on the grid in Vietnam. So it's 9 stages of load shedding. This I do see as a very good option for South Africa.
And a quick win.
A potential quick win. Yeah, there would need to be some reformation that happens within NERSA. And interestingly, as part of my input to the presidency committee regarding the solar rooftop sector, my commentary was, Vietnam was able to do this, and interestingly, within the last month, they installed 6,000 megawatts. Because the industry players, they got into place of supply, skills, upskilling. We haven't spoken about that, but training of solar installation teams, getting the capacity in place to then, in the last month, install 6,000 megawatts or 6 stages of load shedding in 1 month without any money down from the government at all. There was just, we will give you money as we make money from selling power, and we'll give it back to you. So there was no costs from the government's side in doing that. We would need to see NERSA reforming a little bit in terms of being able to give that feed-in tariff for 20 years. But I do see it as a potential quick win or potential good strategy or policy that we can do. So that's now Vietnam.
Yeah.
Australia, there we had the situation where when you go to a democratized state and you have the first movers coming onto the grid and they need to have a cost-reflective tariff that they offer to make their own money back and then make profits, we do see an initial rise in the price of electricity, and now it's continue to rise even further, unfortunately.
Yeah.
That's this Australia example of a developed country. What's meant to happen is it's meant to competition breed excellence, and the price of electricity is meant to come down, as we saw in America, Europe, Australia. I mean, not Australia, England. They were the kind of the front runners of that model. Yeah. I could say that there's interesting contexts that has been a little bit different for Australia. Their location, their inability to rely on neighbours to get power, and some power too when they've got too little or too much power. Also the price of coal, there seems to be conflict with China, and kind of almost like a, not conflict per se, but competition. Yes. With China and the price of their coal being very high. So then, and not just the coal, but also the batteries they put down. They put down big battery assets that are quite expensive to recoup the money spent and to recoup the money that's used to buy coal. Unfortunately, the price of electricity has increased and gone up higher. So we do face that as a potential risk, and I do see that when we go towards the democratized state, the price of electricity initially going up, unfortunately, and then declining after that. So it's almost like the lesser of two evils, as we can put it that way. Unfortunately, we find ourselves in a situation where it seems like we can't just rely on Eskom to somehow solve its problems and get itself out of the hole that it's found itself in, the debt spiral that it found itself in. We can't rely on Eskom. So we need to go towards the state, but the state does have cons, this democratized state, of the electricity, price of electricity going higher. And so there I'd love to see the government coming in and assisting the people that can't afford electricity by somehow subsidizing for the poorest of the poor to still receive electricity, even though the free market state is increasing the price of electricity. So we will need to see the South African government coming to the party in that sense as well. I hope that answers the question.
Absolutely. Mathew, let's move our focus now to Europe.
To Europe, and then opening up of coal power stations to make sure that they have enough electricity to provide for their people when the demand hits and there's not too much sun and there's not too much wind, because there was a big drive from Europe to invest in solar and wind, but those need to be supplemented by hydropower, by batteries, by gas dispatchable power, which is, by the way, like 5 times less emissions than coal. So it's viewed as a transitionary fuel away from coal to renewables and battery. There was a focus on the intermittent power that comes with the aspect of renewable, and not so much the how are we going to provide power in the evenings and the mornings without gas. So there wasn't too much investment and focus on hydropower or batteries or gas turbines at the time. And then the conflict highlighted that there's actually sensitivity in the system. It's quite a sensitive, it's quite a fragile system when you go towards that and you're relying on intermittent power, and we saw the closing down of nuclear power stations in Germany as an example, which I don't think is a good move. They're replacing that power now, unfortunately, with coal and gas. And if that policy wasn't taken, and not to say negative things about the German government, but if the policy wasn't taken, then it's a matter of fact that you wouldn't have the need of having so much coal and gas on your system, because you would have a whole bunch of electricity being generated by nuclear plants that have been maintained and life extension and maybe built as well. So we see a kind of a misalignment of priorities that then led to a fragile state of the energy sector and the over-reliance on Russia, so that there wasn't energy sovereignty within Europe or within each country to take care of their own power needs. So a lesson we can take away from that for South Africa is how do we become non-reliant on foreign countries to be able to provide power for our nation. So how do we not become reliant on natural gas shipped from Turkey, for instance, to South Africa for electricity? How do we source the natural gas naturally and still maybe use the same assets potentially, but how do we get the resources we need sourced locally to provide our own energy needs? So that's the aspect of what leadership could learn. And then was
very much Mathew Cruz for participating in the podcast Interrogating Strategy with Denice. Mathew, again, thank you, and your contribution is much appreciated.
Great, and thank you for the
wishing you all the best.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.
Mathew Cruz, ladies and gentlemen, energy expert here in South Africa.